Oh hey guys, one of the questions I get asked the most is what are my top recommendations for comic titles or comic book stories? We're talking the best of the best. So today I'm going to attempt to answer that question. And I say attempt because with so many great comics over the decades, it is incredibly tough to narrow it down to a list of 10. But we never back down from a challenge. So let's get started. This really isn't going to be a ranked list, so we're not going to use our typical countdown format. With that said, let's lead off with our list of 10 comics you have to read before you die, with the hero that started it all, Superman. All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely is a timeless tale that gets to the root of what the character is all about. It's literally a love letter to DC's beacon of light, Superman. This 12-issue series tells the story of a slowly dying Superman after he is poisoned with a massive amount of solar radiation by Lex Luthor. The high levels of solar radiation make him more powerful than ever, but again, it's also killing him, and he only has 1 year left to live. So wanting to make the most of his last days on Earth, Superman reveals his secret identity to the love of his life, Lois Lane, so he can spend his remaining time with her. He also gives her a liquefied form of his DNA for her birthday that will grant her his superpowers for 24 hours. He also takes his good deeds in this story to the next level. For instance, he took several terminally ill children on a flying tour around the world, put Kandor on Mars so that it could thrive under a yellow sun without interfering with human society, rescued an out-of-control train, saved a teenager from committing suicide, created life in the form of Earth Q, and cured cancer. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, friends, because he also leaves a formula to create a new Superman for Earth after he dies, as he doesn't want to leave them without a Superman. It kind of pulls on the heartstrings a bit. This story again is a true love letter for Superman and demonstrates why Superman is easily one of the best superheroes ever created, and a true beacon of light and hope. Now, if Superman is the light, Batman is definitely the dark. And no story shows how dark and twisted the Batman universe can be more than The Killing Joke. This story is more of a Joker story than a Batman story, and is easily in my top 3 favorite comics of all time, which is a testament to how interesting, deep, and twistedly awesome Batman villains can be. Everyone knows Joker is the yin to Batman's yang, and The Killing Joke is the perfect example why. For those of you who haven't read it, it's the closest we've ever got to getting an origin story for the Joker. We see via flashbacks that a man who possibly became the Joker was a failed comedian and gets mixed up with some gangsters. Shortly after, his pregnant wife died, and then during his first criminal outing, he fell into a vat of acid while wearing Red Hood's costume, which led to him becoming the Joker. In the present, the Joker shoots Barbara Gordon, which paralyzes her from the waist down, and kidnaps Jim Gordon, forcing him to look at naked pictures of his injured daughter. And Joker does all this to try to make the point to Jim and Batman that anyone could go crazy with just one bad day, just like he did. The story is brilliantly crafted by writer Alan Moore and shows us a glimpse of Joker's thought process and reasoning. But it also shows that while the Joker used his one bad day as an excuse to be a force of chaos, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way for everyone, as he couldn't break Jim Gordon, even with all those awful things he did to him. And let's not forget, Batman also used his one bad day as a force for justice. Mix all that with the amazing art by Brian Boland, and you have a masterpiece. The third comic on this list is Garth Ennis's 60-run issue of the Punisher Max series. This title strips down Punisher to the roots of what makes the character so compelling. He's just a normal man out to permanently eliminate as much crime as he can by any means necessary. And I do mean by any means necessary. The run put Punisher in a more realistic, gritty world than usual, and also made Frank Castle older and more jaded. Then you mix that with the easy-to-hate villains like sex traffickers, drug lords, and the like, and you have this series. This title also explores the toll it takes on Frank Castle as he plays a one-man army waging a war on crime. So it's widely known for adding a ton of depth to the Punisher as a character. But if you enjoy just seeing the Punisher stab, shoot, and just give bad guys what they deserve, fear not, this series has tons of that as well. Next, we have the Marvels comic by writer Kurt Busiek and artist Alex Ross. I would assume a good amount of you have never heard of this comic, but that's all the more reason I put it on this list. This comic is great because it's a fascinating concept along with beautiful art by Alex Ross. It's set in the 1939 to 1974 time period and takes place from the viewpoint of a news photographer named Phil Sheldon. We get his side or perspective of what the Marvel Universe looks like to the everyday person that lives within it. It's pretty incredible to see. I can't stress it enough, seeing what it's like for an everyday person who lives in the Marvel Universe is fascinating, with each issue of this 5-part series featuring stories that longtime Marvel fans are very familiar with, like the death of Gwen Stacy, the Fantastic Four fighting Galactus, and so on. As a result, we get more details about some of Marvel Comics' most iconic moments throughout the series. It's amazing. I love it when a good story is retold from a different viewpoint or perspective. So to see this in comics is a delight. And let's be honest, anything Alex Ross draws is a visual masterpiece. So you combine that with a great story and you have one of the best comics ever. The fifth comic you need to read before you die is my favorite Flash story of all time, and that would be Flash Rebirth by Geoff Johns and Ethan Van Sciver. This is the original Flash Rebirth comic, not the current book being written by Josh Williamson that's part of the DC Comics Rebirth initiative. Although, that one's really good too. Anyway, I feel like although the original Rebirth story is highly praised amongst fans, it's still not given enough credit for just how much the story changed and added to the Flash's mythos. I mean, any massive Flash fan like me will tell you this story was responsible for some of the biggest moments in Flash's history, like revealing that Barry Allen created the Speed Force, which was one of the coolest reveals ever. We also find out that Thawne Reverse Flash created his own negative Speed Force, which is not only super important to the story, but would become something crucial to Thawne's character in future stories. Probably the biggest reveal, however, is that Thawne Reverse Flash is responsible for killing Barry's mother. And to add insult to injury, he also framed Barry's father for it, as a double FU to Barry. So besides the amazing art by Ethan Van Sciver, who does such a good job at drawing speedsters, and fantastic writing by Geoff Johns, this story is just super important to Flash's mythos. In conclusion, if you're a Flash fan and you haven't read it, you need to get on that. This next comic would likely be on almost anyone's comics to read before you die list, and that would be Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. This 12-issue miniseries takes the idea of superheroes and flips it on its head. The series showed us that even superheroes could have their own moral issues and aren't always at the peak of perfect humanity. For instance, the comedian tried to rape one of his teammates, and Ozymandias creates a gigantic kaiju-like creature that killed countless people. But Ozymandias does this to create a new threat that forced the world to come together to fight it, which eventually led to world peace, and plays with the greater good question. This story deals with superheroes in a way less happy-go-lucky way, and instead gives us a grittier, more complex group of heroes. Characters like Rorschach, Night Owl, and Dr. Manhattan are so different in their own ways that it adds tons of depth and conflict, both internal and external. In the end, Watchmen is way more than just another superhero comic, and deals with many problems and issues still relatable in our society today. Put it this way, this story is so good that in 2005, Time put it on their 100 greatest English language novels of the 20th century. It of course also became a live-action movie in 2009, which I loved, despite the split fan reaction. Next is easily one of my favorite Spider-Man stories of all time. Spider-Man: Kraven's Last Hunt by J.M. DeMatteis and Mike Zeck. Ironically, this Spider-Man story deals more with the villain Kraven the Hunter than it does with Spider-Man. It's kind of funny that a good amount of the best stories in comics actually deal with more of the villain side of things. Villains for the most part are way more complex and don't have boundaries, allowing the writers to go farther with them than they sometimes can with heroes. But I digress. Kraven the Last Hunt explores the concept of what exactly would happen to a villain if he finally achieved his greatest goal and killed the hero. It's easily one of the darkest and most thought-provoking Spider-Man stories ever written. In fact, the tone is so different that it reads more like a Batman story. So if you want a Spider-Man story that dives deep into the psychology of one of his greatest villains, as well as seeing Spider-Man dig himself out of a grave like a boss, here you go. Most of us would probably agree that Daredevil is the best Marvel series on Netflix. I know I love it. Well, a large part of the show's success is because it's loosely based off of Frank Miller's Daredevil run. More specifically, his 5-issue miniseries, Daredevil, The Man Without Fear. This was a close one for me as I was going back and forth between this and Frank Miller's other great Daredevil story, Daredevil Born Again. Ultimately, I went with his Man Without Fear run because it literally redefined the character for a whole new generation. This story gives us a more in-depth look at Matt Murdock's childhood, his relationship with his father, and how he dealt with the dramatic accident that left him blind as a kid. We even get a detailed look at how Stick trained him and helped him master his newfound senses. For the majority of the series, Matt Murdock wears that black makeshift costume made popular by his Netflix series. In fact, it isn't to the very end of the series, literally the last page of issue 5, that Murdock dons his iconic red costume with the double D's on it. As Kevin Smith would say, Frank Miller and John Romita Jr. did the Lord's work with this comic. In a nutshell, it gives us one of the best retellings and looks at a character's origin of all time. Next up is yet another Alan Moore comic, V for Vendetta. which makes this the third comic written by Alan Moore to make it on this list. But what can I say, the man knows how to write an amazing comic, even though he's apparently no longer a big fan of superhero comics, but that's a whole different story. Anyway, V for Vendetta, like most of Moore's writing, acts as a social commentary and contains tons of symbolism and metaphor, particularly regarding the UK's conservative government system of the 1980s, which was pulling back on its people's freedom and individuality. The comic follows its main protagonist, V, who's an anarchist revolutionary that wears the now famous Guy Fawkes mask. He begins an elaborate and theatrical revolutionist campaign to kill his former captors and oppressors, bring down the fascist state, and convince the people to abandon democracy in favor of anarchy, all while inspiring a young woman, Evie Hammond, to be his protege. If that sounds compelling and super interesting, that's because it is. So compelling, in fact, that this comic also received a live-action movie in 2005, which I love as well. It's just glorious all around. The 10th and final comic you need to read before you die, which I'm sure many of you may have guessed by now, is The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. Like several others on this list, this comic is a no-brainer and almost a prerequisite for any sort of best comics list. Even after 30 years, The Dark Knight Returns is still universally considered a masterpiece. It's a gritty dystopian Batman story that focuses on a retired middle-aged Bruce Wayne, who decides to once again don the cape and cowl to clean up the crime-filled streets of Gotham one more time. The problem is the city is now way less tolerant of vigilantes like Batman. This comic was also the first instance where Batman was seen as a rough, edgy brute who doesn't take crap from anyone. When all said and done, it literally changed the character of Batman forever. That's not what I meant. But beyond changing Batman's character, it also permanently changed the comic industry. With 4 glorious issues, Miller managed to show everyone just how compelling a superhero story can be, by embedding real-world tones and placing the characters in a grittier environment. The series is so loved that it received a 2-part movie by DC Animation and is the biggest inspiration for the DCEU's Batman. I mean, BVS even did a version of the iconic fight in The Dark Knight Returns, where an armored Batman fights Superman. What it all comes down to is that if you're a comic fan in any facet, you need to read this story, along with all the other comics I mentioned today, before you die. And before we wrap up, I know some of you are probably wondering how Neil Gaiman's Sandman didn't make this list. Well, to be quite honest, I just never really got into Sandman all that much. I'm not taking anything away from his work on the character. This is just a subjective list, and I just personally don't gravitate to it as much as others. Having said that, it is a very solid read, and I completely understand why it would be on anyone else's list. Speaking of other people's lists, let us know what 10 comics would be on your Read Before You Die list in the comment section below. First up for Wednesday, May 30th, we have X-Men Red Annual 1. Putting it simply, this issue is all about Jean Grey. If you're a fan of Jean Grey, check this out as it gives you a deeper look at the character. Here we have Man of Steel issue 1. A new era begins for Superman as the threat from his earliest origins re-emerges to destroy the last son of Krypton. Now we have Amazing Spider-Man 800. One of the biggest Peter Parker Norman Osborn stories of all time unfolds over one oversized story. Would you expect anything different from issue 800? Next we have Justice League No Justice issue 4, the epic finale that everyone will be talking about. After the unimaginable happens, the DC Universe must band together to defend Earth from annihilation. And finally we have Doomsday Clock issue 5. The comedian lives, the mime and Mariette lose in Gotham City, Rorschach is locked in the bowels of Arkham Asylum, and secrets will be revealed as the Doomsday Clock ticks on. And that's going to bring another episode of Variant to a close, but remember to go to variantcomics.com/giveaways to enter our Deadpool giveaway. All the details for that are going to be in the description below. Other than that, be sure to follow us on our Twitter, our Facebook, and Instagram. All links for those are in the description as well. And if you like the channel, be sure to subscribe and then hit the bell next to it so you're notified whenever we upload a new video. But I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things comics.